picking up from our discussion of Michelet and his romantic vision, we now turn to Leopold von Ranke. He's often seen as the counterpoint, the founder of what became known as historical realism. The text kicks off with a classic anecdote. Ranke, initially captivated by Sir Walter Scott's vivid tales of chivalry, decided to dig into the actual sources. What he found: not just a few inaccuracies, but a revelation. The real Middle Ages were even more fascinating than Scott's novels. This wasn't just a minor correction, it was a profound shift. Ranke realized truth in its raw documented form was infinitely more compelling than any fictionalized account. His response? A vow to stick strictly to the facts, the evidence, and ditch those romantic impulses that might lead him astray. His mission became clear: write history as it actually happened. Now Ranke's rejection wasn't just about ditching Scott or the Romantics. It was broader. Think of it like a multi-front war against the intellectual trends of his time. He pushed back against Hegel's tendency to derive history from grand philosophical systems a priori philosophizing. He also resisted the allure of mechanistic explanations, the kind popular in the physical sciences and positivist social theory, which sought universal laws. And, crucially, he distanced himself from the dogmatism of official religious creeds. Why all this pushback? Essentially, Ranke wanted unobstructed access to the historical field itself, to see it in its immediate, particular, and vivid reality. His brand of realism wasn't just about saying no. It was about defining what was left when you said no to all these other dominant ways of seeing the world. So, does this mean Ranke was just a naive empiricist, simply collecting facts without interpretation? The text argues against that common interpretation. While he championed objectivity, his view, termed here historism following Meineke, wasn't empty-handed. It operated within a specific set of assumptions prevalent in his academic circle. To really grasp the unique flavor of Ranke's realism, the author proposes calling it doctrinal realism. Why doctrinal? Because it's not based on a predefined theory about how the world fundamentally works. Instead, it's rooted in the act of consciously rejecting the dominant forms of modern thought, art, science, and philosophy, believing that this very act of repudiation allows for a realistic engagement with reality. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of Ranke's epistemology, how he thought we know history. The text notes that his core approach was pretty solidified by around 1850. Big events like the revolutions of 1848 and 1871 didn't really shake his fundamental beliefs. In his 1824 preface, he stated his goal was to relate histories in their unity. But how? Through particulars. He acknowledged this focus on details could make his narrative seem harsh, disconnected, maybe even boring. But the sublime ideal he aimed for, the event in its human intelligibility, its unity, and its diversity, could only be reached by moving from the particular to the general. Never the reverse. This became a cornerstone of his method. Ranke further clarified this in an 1830s fragment. He laid out two paths to knowledge for a secular mind, one through the perception of the particular, the other through abstraction. Which one is history's method? The first dealing with specifics, philosophy? That's the second path, the realm of abstraction. And what makes someone worthy of being a historian? Two key qualities, according to Ranke: a genuine love for the particular for itself, appreciating it on its own terms, and a strong resistance to the authority of preconceived ideas, those grand theories that might distort the facts. Only by reflecting on these particulars, he argued, would the larger picture, the development of the world in general, become apparent. But here's where it gets interesting. While emphasizing particulars, Ranke also stressed that the course of world development couldn't be captured by those universal concepts philosophers love to trade in. History is too complex, too nuanced for one thought or one word. However, he didn't entirely abandon the idea of an underlying order. He believed the world showed evidence of governance by a spiritual power, a force that ultimately unites the historical particulars into a whole. This spiritual dimension justified seeing history as more than just brute force struggles. Now, understanding this spirit required religious consciousness, something he wouldn't use to solve specific historical puzzles, but a sublimated, purified form of this religious sense, was necessary for properly appreciating the parts and their relationship to the whole. His ultimate, always elusive goal: composing a history of mankind, a synthesis that remained forever just out of reach. Ranke anticipated critics who might worry about getting lost in vague generalities, arguing that diligent research had moved beyond such superficial judgments. He insisted historical work must operate on two levels simultaneously, digging into the effective factors of specific events while also grasping their universal relationship. The ideal, he said, was to comprehend the whole while rigorously obeying the dictates of exact research. Without linking to the universal, research becomes weak. Without rigorous research, the universal becomes a phantom. It's a delicate balance, aiming for a deep understanding that connects the specific to the general, the particular to the whole. This brings us to a common critique, highlighted by historian Henry Steele Commager, referencing von Laue's work. The argument goes, Ranke's method, the emphasis on sources, objectivity, detail survived, but his grander, almost philosophical or religious conclusions, the hints of divine purpose or spiritual forces, got dropped. Fair enough, but the text pushes back. It argues that concepts like objectivity or critical study aren't neutral tools. They carry implicit assumptions about what truth is and how reality can be known. These very assumptions are what allowed Ranke to justify his larger conclusions. His massive output wasn't just due to diligence. It stemmed from a deep confidence in his own criterion for judging historical significance, a confidence that made him a model for historians across the board. Ranke intuitively understood that his new historiography needed to reject the metonymical mode, think mechanistic causation, the idea that everything links directly to everything else, and the ironic undertones that question values. Herder had already paved some ground here. The political turmoil of the Revolution and Reaction also hammered home the limits of abstract approaches. Romanticism, meanwhile, had shown the power of irrational human drives. But Ranke couldn't just fall back on pure metaphor either. That wouldn't give history the scientific authority he craved. Nor could he fully embrace the synecdochic mode, looking for formal patterns and structures too quickly, lest he be accused of idealism, imposing his own system onto the past. It was a tightrope walk. So what did Ranke do? He used metaphor to initially paint the historical scene, focusing on the vividness, color, and variety of individual events and their uniqueness. Then he introduced synecdoche, suggesting a deeper structure, a field of formal coherences. The ultimate unity, something hinted at, analogous to the nature of the parts. This clever move allowed him to sidestep the need for universal causal laws, whether synchronic positivist ones or dialectical Hegelian ones. Instead, the highest form of explanation for Ranke became narrative description itself. However, the text points out a potential blind spot. By rejecting romanticism, he still relied on narration, which inherently requires a plot structure. And that structure, it turns out, was often a classic comic one. Indeed, the text argues that the comic mythos served as the underlying plot structure for much of Ranke's work. Imagine each of his histories as an act in a grand cosmic play. This framework gave him the confidence to sift through mountains of documents, selecting what seemed significant and discarding the rest. His celebrated objectivity, critical principles, and sympathy for all sides of conflict all operated within this sustaining atmosphere. What kind of resolution did this comic plot promise? Conflicts must inevitably end in harmonious resolutions, where nature is finally supplanted by a stable and just society. It's a tidy, reassuring conclusion. Look at his essay, The Great Powers. Here the sanctioning metaphor is clearly organicist. He talks about forces, spiritual, life-giving, creative energies, moral energies unfolding, capturing the world, appearing in manifold expressions, disputing, checking, overpowering one another. The secret of world history lies in this dynamic interplay, this life cycle of rise, fall, rejuvenation. Time itself gains value because it seems to move towards a goal, though the goal remains unspecified, characterized only as achieving a higher level of formal coherence. It's a process view, emphasizing growth and development. But then in his dialogue on politics, Ranke specifies the goal of this process. He uses a different metaphor, The nation-states emerging after the medieval chaos are like celestial bodies. They grow irresistibly, progressing amidst turmoil towards the ideal. Behold them, these celestial bodies, in their cycles, their mutual gravitation, their systems. Notice the shift. The earlier organicist image of growth gives way to a mechanical one, focusing on balance, order, and systems. History isn't ending, but it has entered a phase of rule-governed movement within a self-balancing system. The system itself is now seen as fixed, not subject to further radical change. So, how does Ranke analyze this historical process? He sets up a kind of grammar. The historical field sustained by God is populated by discrete objects, individuals constituted by God who combine into peoples also individually constituted by God. These peoples then create institutions, churches, and states to realize their destinies as nations. Humans, both individually and collectively, are driven by natural passion, making them inherently disorderly and destructive. But crucially, the church and the state are presented as instruments to channel these energies into beneficial projects. Rank isn't interested in origins. He takes the generally beneficial character of these institutions as a given, a fact of history confirmed by both historical study and everyday experience. Privately, he believed God founded them for order. Publicly, their ordering function was evident. Within this framework, the primary forces are order represented by the church and state versus disorder represented by peoples. Since people make up both churches and states, there's overlap. The danger arises when institutions overstep their bounds. If the church usurps state power, political strength declines. If the state usurps spiritual authority, spiritual energy diminishes and morality degenerates. Such imbalances lead to civil strife, making the nation vulnerable to conquest by neighbors who maintain a better balance of power within their own specific national ideas. A threatened nation needs reserves of strength or reforms to avoid disappearing from history. Sometimes, a specific conception of the state or church gains excessive power, expanding beyond its suitable people to become universal. Think the Roman Catholic Church or the Holy Roman Empire. Ranke argued this happened in the Middle Ages, slow of peaceful progress, hindering the development of distinct nations and causing a Gothic gloom. The Renaissance and Reformation, along with the religious wars, were pivotal. Reformers attacked both universal church and state ideas, while affirming Christian truth and European unity. They created new, nation-specific forms of church and state, adequate to each people's unique needs, guided by their national ideas. This emergence of the nation as a self-conscious governing principle was key. Once European peoples constituted themselves as distinct nation-states with their own suited institutions, a new phase began. A self-regulating system of cultural organization. Each nation's internal relations were governed by its national idea, while externally, the idea of Europe functioned to regulate relations between nations. The principle here? Diversity and unity. Its overt expression, the balance of power. Unlike some archaic conservatives who saw only evil in the French Revolution, Ranke granted it positive outcomes. Nations achieved self-consciousness, great powers found a common purpose in mutual preservation, and Europe entered a millennium of peaceful progress, free from major revolutions or wars of total annihilation. For Ranke, this constitution of self-regulating nation-states, united in a larger community, marked the end of history as previously known. History, in essence, ended in his present, the mid-19th century. The basic form of all future development was fixed. The system was near perfectly balanced, requiring only occasional adjustments like Newton's divine watchmaker tweaking the system, perhaps manifesting as civil disturbances or limited wars. It's a remarkably static view of the future, built upon the perceived completion of the nation-state system. Now we can certainly evaluate Ranke's interpretation of European history on its own merits, using his own methods of source criticism and objective fact determination. He was even open to critics pointing out things he missed, like economic factors. But the text argues that one element in his system functioned differently, his notion of the idea of the nation. This wasn't just another historical concept, it carried special weight. The idea of the nation wasn't just one idea among many. For Ranke, It was the sole possible principle for achieving peaceful progress. It was both a historical datum and a supreme value. It was the lens through which everything in history could be judged positive or negative. He characterized it as eternal, changeless, a thought of God. Peoples, churches, and states might come and go, but the idea of the nation was timeless, the essence that gave them being. Grasping this idea was key to understanding any specific nation. But this idea is only knowable when actualized in a specific nation-state. This implies that all civilizations before the rise of modern European nation-states existed in a kind of proto-historical night. The true dawn of history for Ronchi was the 16th century, culminating in his own time, the noontime of history, when the self-regulating system of nation-states was finally achieved. He acknowledged past revolutions and convulsions, but the future, it was merely an indefinite extension of his present order. His contemporary reality became the benchmark for all time. Because the nation-state system was the goal, everything else was seen as an imperfect attempt. Once achieved, no further fundamental forms of social organization were possible. The only alternative Ranke could conceive was some kind of international or transnational system based on universal principles. But he dismissed this possibility by appealing to history itself. Such universal forms had been tried in the Middle Ages. The universal church and imperium failed and were permanently superseded. Attempts at universalism in his own time, liberalism, socialism, communism, were merely occasions for strengthening the eternally viable national idea. Ranke explicitly argued that wars don't determine the fundamental forms of political organization, only modify them. Comparing his age to the Hellenistic period, he saw the latter as lacking individual principles, relying solely on soldiers and money, hence its rapid dissolution. His own age, however, possessed moral strength and the principle of nationality, ensuring the endurance of states. Thus, the historian's task, according to Ranke, was to reinforce nationality as the safeguard against barbarism. He even suggested a system of nation-states could last forever, like a conversation among gods. Civilization, he argued, depends on diversity. Union must rest on the independence of each. True harmony emerges from separation and independent development. This stance reveals Ranke's conservatism. By elevating the nation idea as absolute, notions of universality and individual freedom appeared as threats to history itself, either totalitarianism or anarchy. This perspective discouraged searching for universal laws of human association, as such a search would undermine the historical contingency of national characteristics. Anything challenging the authority of church, state, or nation, materialism, capitalism, socialism, ecumenical religion, was seen as a threat to civilization. Movements trusting in liberated human nature were dismissed as sentimental humanitarianism, or, if revolutionary, as forces needing suppression by established institutions. So, where does Ranke's method break down? It works beautifully when states, churches, peoples, and nations are clear, stable entities with observable characteristics. The historian's job is to reconstruct how they formed national communities guided by their national ideas. But what happens when these entities are problematic, not yet fully formed, weakening, or tottering? When the very principles of social organization cease to be self-evident, and the question arises of what constitutes the best human community. At that point, Ranke's empirical method falters. Other methods and conceptual categories are needed. This search led to the new social sciences of the late 19th century, which were generally hostile to the Rankean approach, particularly its naive inductionism and its implicit assumption that the nation is the only valid unit of analysis. Comparing Ranke and Michelet, the text notes a curious duality. Ranke is easier to characterize in one sense, harder in another. Why? Because the comic plot structure he employs creates a more formally coherent narrative than Michelet's romantic history, which often follows a Manichaean protagonist-antagonist conflict. Michelet's plot involves the gradual rise of the French people, achieving unity, then falling from grace. He wrote this history from the perspective of the fall, projecting back onto a receding shore. Ranke, however, experienced the Restoration period, the culmination of Michelet's protagonist's journey, as a genuine consummation, a real integration of previously conflicting elements into the nation-state system. While Herder's organicist intuition was still present in Ranke, it was channeled into this comic plot structure. Michelet's story is a classic Manichaean battle where one side must defeat the other. Rank, however, frames conflict within a larger context, emphasizing what society gains from struggle itself. The final unity, humanity, is pushed to the end of time, serving as a hoped-for goal. Primary importance is given to the achieved forms, the institutions and nations forged through centuries of conflict. This comic ternary movement from apparent peace to conflict to resolution allowed Ranke to confidently delineate the main periods of European history. This confidence in mapping the historical field, viewed spatially or synchronically, led Ranke to divide Western Europe into its cultural substrata, language families, peoples, nations, and political religious organizations, all interconnected by the balance of power. His strategy was to analyze parts out of wholes, and then reconstitute wholes out of the parts within his narrative. The mode of characterization here is synecdoche. His explanations resemble Michelet's in focusing on the texture of events within their context, but they also provide a sense of succession, of formal coherencies integrating into a larger whole, European civilization itself. Ranke's explanation operates on two levels. First, answering what happened involves inserting an event into its context, showing the threads connecting it to other events, creating a rich texture resistant to simple causal laws. Second, answering why did it happen as it did involves moving from one context, one achieved form, to another, demonstrating higher integration, using the mode of organicism. By denying knowledge of the ultimate form of forms, he elevates his own time, the latest stage of this process, to the status of a putative telos, a purpose towards which all preceding stages point. The historical field is first seen as a complex web of events, then mapped as a pattern of integrated totalities, microcosms reflecting a macrocosm. To understand the formal underpinnings of Ranke's approach, employment as comedy, explanation as organicism, we need to look beyond Ranke's own writings. The text directs us to Wilhelm von Humboldt's influential 1821 essay, On the Tasks of the Historian. Momiliano called Ranke an ideal pupil of Humboldt, and this essay provides a formal defense of the principles that combined Ranke's narrative style with his organicist explanation to yield specifically conservative ideological conclusions. Humboldt starts by firmly denying that history can be understood through nomological laws, universal causal rules. The historian's best hope is a simple presentation of what actually happened. But this doesn't mean passive reception. The historian must be active and creative. Why? Because events are only partially visible. The rest must be filled in through intuition, inference, guesswork. Manifestations are scattered, disjointed. The essential unity is hidden. Observation alone gives us circumstances, not the inner causal nexus. What we see are like clouds taking shape only at a distance. The historian uses imagination like a poet to reveal the truth by connecting fragments, but unlike a poet, he can't use pure fantasy. He needs a unique connective ability. This connective ability, Humboldt suggests, comes from applying the laws of necessity to temper the intuitive faculty. Historians must simultaneously practice exact, impartial investigation and connect the events explored. But crucially, this connecting ability shouldn't extend to encompassing the entire historical process. Why? Because the historical field is a vast serried turmoil arising from soil, human nature, character, and even springing up as if planted by miracle, dependent on powers dimly perceived. The mind can never press the whole into a single form. The historian's willingness to stop short, to impose only provisional coherence on finite parts, is what makes his approach specifically realistic. The historian's task is to awaken a sensibility for reality. What is this sense of reality? It's a dual awareness, recognizing the transience of existence and dependence on causes, and consciousness of spiritual freedom and reason. Only this paradoxical awareness allows the historian to compose narratives that stir the reader's emotions as if by reality itself. This sounds remarkably similar to Carlyle's romantic chaos of being. Yet, Humboldt explicitly denied history could instruct the present on what to do. Its value lies in refining our sense of acting on reality, primarily by providing the form attached to events, not just the events themselves. Here the synecdochic impulse is clear. Historical explanation, then, is revealing the true form or inner structure of events. Every event described reveals the form of history per se. This is a synecdochic operation. Every part reflects the whole. Fully carrying this out leads to philosophy of history. Humboldt distinguishes between mere copying of external shape like a draftsman and figuring the inner form like a true artist, which requires providing the idea that transforms data into formal coherence. This distinction sets up a potential tension between objective representation and subjective interpretation. Could this riff on the historian's idea lead to subjectivity? Humboldt anticipates this and asks, are there ideas capable of guiding the historian? He distinguishes between aesthetic, philosophical, and historical ideas. He aligns historical knowledge with Aristotle's knowledge belonging to poetry. Understanding is a product of the event's constitution and the sensibility applied by the beholder. There's an elective affinity between the nature of historical events, tensions between forms and trends, and the modes of comprehension the historian brings. Historical truth, he claims, is more threatened by philosophical handling than artistic. Philosophy seeks teleology, the historian deals with processes. The historian must deal with trends, not ultimate ends. He shouldn't impose his notions of final meaning, but let ideas emerge from events or originate in contemplation. This seems contradictory, but Humboldt resolves it by saying all understanding applies a pre-existing general idea to specifics. That idea in history is derived from the operations of the human heart. Despite raising the possibility of scientific explanation, Humboldt dissolves it, denying nomological comprehension. He falls back on art analogy, assuming the adequacy of formal ideas in the imagination. The result is a formist, typological theory reducing chaos to general formal coherence akin to neoclassical ideals. It ignores the romantic view of mind-imposing form, instead reasserting a less metaphysical version of perfect consciousness being consonant with reality. Humboldt argues the historian conceives a general picture of the connection of all events, from which he derives the essential connection of the historical process. But he rejects three inadequate approaches: mechanistic, physiological, and psychological explanations. Why? Because they focus on causal connection and fail to achieve a viewpoint outside the compass of the finite, from which the whole can be comprehended. Instead, he offers his own doctrine of ideas, based on generalizations from reflection on the totality of the human heart's operations being adequate to world history. Parts of history must be integrated into a vision of the whole based on world governance, a higher principle of unity, whose nature is unspecified but inferred. The historian can identify necessary conditions for novelty. He can only determine sufficient conditions. Since science aims for both, the historian's search for such conditions is ruled out. Faced with novelties like the sudden flourishing of Greek art, which Humboldt sees as miraculous, individual achievement, the historian's task is not to explain it, but to represent it as a manifestation of essential human freedom. Dissolution, however, is attributed to involvement in phenomenal existence, tacitly allowing material or psychological explanations. This creates a curious asymmetry. Spiritual force governs actualization, but material forces govern dissolution. Birth and growth are valued more than decay. This seems designed to offset historical consciousness with optimism. Taking the first step, the spark of novelty is miraculous. Without it, favorable circumstances are useless. This emphasis on emergent novelty leads to viewing history as spirit over matter, form over content. Humboldt wants to frame this as movement from inner to outer being, avoiding specifying the end, thus slipping into idealism. He claims thought can conceive history ideally, but not comprehend it under an idealistic vision. This formalism, condemned by Hegel, shows up when Humboldt perceives ideal forms in language, yet denies direct perception of world plans, claiming we can only divine them in ideas. Ultimately, the goal of history is the actualization of the idea realized by mankind in all finite forms, until both the finite form and the idea are no longer capable of further mutual integration. The historian perceives ideas unfolding in the nexus of world events without being part of those events. The final task, then, is the presentation of the struggle of an idea to realize itself in actuality. Crucially, this involves struggle, as the idea might fail, become perverted. But even failures are conceived as ultimately comic, because the whole is governed by a freedom dimly figured in the parts. The emphasis shifts to the freedom of change and emergence, resisting the search for a coherent pattern of the whole, which would imply determinism. So how does this relate to Herder? There's a shift. Less emphasis on seeking total integration, more on a formist explanation replacing Herder's organicism. This loosens the texture of the historical field and dampens the urge to understand processes deeply. But the overall framework, the mythic significance, the comic nature remains. It's a modification where the drive for explanation is sublimated into simply describing the process. The meaning stays the same, a comic drama heading towards a yet unrealized resolution. Maintaining this comic frame allows Ronke and Humboldt to treat conflict as real but temporary, viewing defeats as mere opportunities for the idea to eventually triumph. Evil and suffering are occasions for the spirit's manifestations. The historian's job is to narrate these transient formal coherences, treating the appearance of new forms as a miracle, something perceived but not fully comprehended. However, this system struggled with the dark side of history. How could abnormal states, disease, evil, injustice, have ideal form like goodness or truth? Humboldt admitted an analogy, but couldn't integrate these trends into his historical drama. The dark side remained mysterious. The core issue, the text argues, isn't just individual versus general, or art versus science, but how context is conceived, and whether the historical process is seen as uplifting or depressing. Both Humboldt and Ronke agreed history is about knowing individual events in context, is an art form, and aims to divine the meaning of the whole. The real debate is about how that context is understood and the moral implications of the process. In conclusion, Ranke's thought represents a definitive break from Romanticism's focus on individual uniqueness and interiority, yet he resisted succumbing to pure revel of forms. He believed history, despite its chaos, displayed meaning through the apprehension of formal coherence, a purely organicist meaning, albeit limited to the part-whole relationship. Full comprehension of the totality was reserved for religious sensibility. The historian, however, could find meaning in tracing these forms across time. This organicist doctrine was his main contribution to establishing history as a discipline. The real tension was between demanding rigorous conceptualization Hegel and resisting it Humboldt-Ronke, valuing obscurity where novelty intrinsically resists analysis. This belief in an underlying comic plot, a plausible resolution, saved this approach from despair. The threat wasn't theoretical critique, but alternative emplotments like tragic or absurdist dramas gaining traction when faith in a comic resolution waned, paving the way for positivism, Marxism, etc. Organicism itself didn't vanish, but shifted from comic to absurdist framing. Humboldt's significance lies in championing this synecdochic comic dream of historical coherence. Both Michelet and Ranke, driven by this conviction, immersed themselves in chaos believing accurate description would reveal a formal order neither science nor philosophy could capture, seeking to grasp the essence of an idea within narrative prose.